Okay, welcome everyone to today's session of Bucerius Legal Tech Essentials. I'm Dan Katz, and I'm your co-host from Chicago, Kent, and Bucerius Law School. Live from my house in Chicago and in our studios in Hamburg. Today's session of Bucerius Legal Tech Essentials is Legal Technology in Silicon Valley. Our speaker today is Dr. Roland Vogel. Roland is a scholar, lawyer, and entrepreneur who has started several companies in the legal technology space. He's also, on the academic side, the executive director of Codex, the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. He has a new book coming out, which is a compendium. Several of the speakers are participating in contributions. It's the research handbook on big data law, so please check that out. So before we turn it over to Roland, I'm going to turn it over to Dirk for a couple of administrative announcements. Over to you, Dirk.
Daniel, thank you. And hi, everybody. And thank you for joining us again. So first of all, I want to highlight how important Codex in Stanford really is for this program and our institution. You will see that many of the people that present in our series this summer actually are affiliated with Codex. And it's very instrumental in shaping thoughts and bringing people together across the world. They have a fabulous conference, Future Law, that happens between April and May every year, and I can encourage each and everyone to go there. All that was made possible by Roland, and that's why we're very lucky to have him. Now, on to the logistical parts. If you have questions, and we encourage you to really ask lots of them, please make sure that you use the Q&A function that you have on Zoom, because that makes it much easier for us to filter through and group them together. We cannot monitor the general chat because there's hundreds and hundreds of people writing in it. So if you want to make sure that your question gets through, please kindly use the Q&A function. Here's how that's going to work. Roland will give his presentation, and we being Dan and me, we will group the questions together and then in a conversation ask Roland afterwards. Now we know that probably we won't get through all the questions because many people have many questions, and that's great. That's why we always say the conversation continues on Twitter. So I'll quickly bring up our hashtag here so that you know what to use when you want to go for it. Conversation continues on Twitter. This is hashtag Bucerius Legal Tech. And that's about all from me right now. You're going to see us back again, and I'll hand it over to Roland here.
Thank you, Dan and Dirk, for the very kind introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this fantastic program. A big shout out to the two of you for turning lemons into lemonade. It's such a fantastic idea to put on this summer of legal tech, and I think the terrific response you get from folks joining your sessions from around the world is a testimony to your ingenuity and innovativeness in this regard. And so I really appreciate this invitation, and thank you again for having me. So Codex, and Dirk, thank you also for your kind words about Codex. Codex is a joint center between the Stanford Law School and Stanford Computer Science Department with a mission of using information technology to make the legal system more efficient for all stakeholders in the legal system, not just legal professionals. And I should say my talk is titled Legal Tech in Silicon Valley. That's where I normally am. I've been at Stanford for a good 20 years now, initially as a student and then as a member of the staff. But currently I'm in Austria, which is where I was born. And I'm in the beautiful mountains of Austria. I'm in a hotel room. Actually, in the background, you see a photo of my hometown, Innsbruck, with its main tourist attraction called the Golden Roof, and many other beautiful things out here to see. Today, I already had a chance to climb up a mountain, and I found myself in a thunderstorm, completely soaked. But I was able to make it back in time for this session, and I'm really, really excited to be here. So Codex is as I said, a research center at Stanford, and I like to use this image of the Stanford main quad. So it's not really an image of the law school, nor is it an image of the computer science department. We are settled. We are a joint venture of both institutions, and our motto is legal empowerment through information technology. We are a research center, but we are also a hotbed of startup activity. So many of our fellows and students have started some of the what I think are some of the most interesting legal tech companies. Of course, I'm a little biased in this regard, but many of our affiliated faculty, entrepreneurial fellows are really, I think, at the forefront of legal innovation in the U.S. and internationally, and so I think this helps us also get a good insight into what's going on in the legal innovation marketplace. And so what I want to do in this session I have with you all is to give you a quick history of legal tech innovation, and then talk about some of the current trends, and then you sort of dare to look into the future a little bit and ask the question, how to succeed in this changing marketplace in the future. All right, so here's my one slide of the history of legal tech innovation, going back to West's American Digest system, which was an early innovation around 1900 that is basically a system that organizes the case law and allows you to identify the relevant cases for your particular matter. And this company obviously was acquired later by Thomson Reuters, but this is an early legal information retrieval information. And we could, of course, go further back in history in terms of legal tech innovation, and go all the way back to the Codex Hammurabi, which was a technological innovation in a sense. Writing down the law for the first time in a tangible medium was an important innovation. But in more recent history, I would probably start with West's American Digest system. And then, the 70s, we started having electronic research. Starting with I think LexisNexis was one of the first companies in this area. Then expert systems, capturing the domain expertise of lawyers in certain areas, and allowing people to query a computer to get answers to legal questions. Then in the 1990s, we saw e-discovery becoming a thing. So electronic discovery, using machines to help us find the relevant legal information in a lawsuit in a faster way, finding the needle in the haystack. Then in the early to mid 2000s, legal process outsourcing, it's not really a big technological innovation, but an innovation in a business model that is enabled by technology. Shortly thereafter, we saw the emergence of multi-sided platforms. Platforms where people with legal needs can find the right lawyer for their legal problem, and then alternative legal service providers in the late 2000s, and then big data law, people using machine learning and data analytics to find the law, relevant law. That became a thing that's still one of the really hot areas in legal innovation. And then all the way up to computational law, computable contracts, and smart contracts on the blockchain. All these things that are sort of more the recent innovations in legal technology. So this is my kind of brief history of legal innovation, or legal tech innovation. My apologies. I'm going to open a window here to get some fresh air in. It's kind of hot here. All right. So now in recent years, all the talk has been about, bringing AI to legal information problems. And the one thing you have to kind of remember is that, AI is just not just one thing. There are many different techniques that fall under the label AI. With regard to computational law, which is really at the heart of the mission of my center. And by computational law, we mean the automation and mechanization of a legal analysis. Computational law leverages two branches of AI techniques, the so-called rules-driven techniques and the data-driven techniques. And, sometimes people don't necessarily kind of distinguish between those. And, sometimes they're kind of like all mixed together. And, we're putting the label robo-lawyer on these different AI techniques that help us sort of automate or mechanize certain legal processes. But really what we mean by those different AI techniques is the rules-driven ones. They use the methods of logic programming, so-called deductive approaches, and they're typically used for systems like those expert systems that have been around for a while, which I mentioned already. In the U.S., everybody understands that TurboTax is the paragon example of a computational law system that has a representation of the tax code programmed into the system, and it can then apply the tax code to an individual user's tax situation. But also legal chatbots use sort of real rules-driven techniques to allow people to kind of query their way through a specific area of the law. And then computable contracts. So these, self-executing operationalizable contracts that most people talk about in a blockchain context, but they're really relevant, sort of far beyond the blockchain. And this is really one area also that my center is focusing on, and we're having a big effort going on in this area. Then, of course, data-driven approaches to solving legal problems. One of the leaders of this fantastic program, Dan Katz, is really the leading authority in this space. The methods being used there are what we call statistical AI, natural language processing, machine learning, neural networks, so-called inductive approaches. And the kind of products that are built with these techniques are helping us to do data analytics on legal information, predictive analytics, predicting legal outcomes, e-discovery, or analyzing contracts, going through large bodies of contracts to understand if there are any kind of landmines in these contracts, or to make sure that companies are complying with contracts. Things of that nature. Those are just examples. There's many more things you can do with those two different approaches to legal, to using AI in legal settings. But I just wanted to kind of familiarize yourself with this fairly important distinction. Much of the excitement in recent years is about the second, the data-driven approaches. There's been so much excitement around machine learning and all these things. So also in legal settings, we're very interested in what you can do with these methods. And if we talk about, many times I use the metaphor of the robo-lawyer, which about until a few years ago, a lot of people in the legal profession were alarmed and felt very threatened that the human lawyers will be replaced by robo-lawyers. And I think that sort of the second strand, these data-driven approaches, were almost more threatening to the kind of old school lawyers, because when you can use a machine to make predictions about legal outcomes that that in the past, lawyers would have to, have had decades of experience to be able to predict how a judge might decide, and they might decide in a particular matter. And now you can use a machine that makes even better predictions, and the junior lawyer or the client, him or herself, can make a prediction about a legal outcome. That's potentially disruptive, quite disruptive to lawyers. And so that's why those maybe were more threatening. But I would also sort of reckon that by saying that there's been somewhat less worries and concerns about the robo-lawyer in recent years. And most of the technologies that we see go out in the market are typically lawyer-enhancing technologies rather than lawyer-replacing technologies. All right, but that's a whole separate conversation. All right, so these are just some kind of the introductory basics I wanted to kind of sort of bring to the fore here. And now I want to talk about some of the trends. So this picture here, is basically, the legal services market, perhaps from the vantage point of a traditional law firm, and it's a picture that's come about, that's sort of been created, I think initially by the dot-com cost recession. And then the big recession, so in the early 2000s, and then accelerated by the big recession of 2008, and I think that picture will even be more sort of accelerated now through the recession that we inevitably will go through, given the current global pandemic. So basically, those different bubbles that you see here are different competitors to the big law firms. And now we have, big law today is competing with, a bunch of different players, alternative legal service providers, legal tech companies, legal process outsourcing companies, and corporate law departments that are insourcing more and more legal work, and then small boutique law firms and regional and mid-sized law firms. And also the big four accounting firms that are investing heavily into providing legal services and providing them in a different way perhaps than traditional law firms have, maybe a more technology-enabled way. So I want to sort of focus on some of those bubbles that you see here to discuss some of the trends that I think are relevant and maybe of interest to you. So let's focus on the legal techs, the legal tech companies, one area that I'm perhaps most excited about. So we see that tech innovation has undoubtedly been growing in importance in the last decade. There's no question. And we see a ton of innovation in search technologies that help us find the relevant law quicker and in better ways. Then big data, using big data analytics to find new insights that we couldn't find just with a fleet of human lawyers. Then computational law, the automation and mechanization of legal analysis again, practice management, and then also in the online dispute resolution area. I would say in online dispute resolution, that's one area where I think that the current global pandemic will accelerate innovation even more. All right, so we've seen, so my center at Stanford, we are tracking early stage legal tech companies. We have over 1,200 early stage companies around the world in there, and we saw a lot of startup activity several years ago. I think the high point was in 2015 in terms of founding new legal techs, and many of those companies, many of them are out of business, of course. That's just the way startups work. But many of those that came about that in maybe between, I would say, 2012 and 2015 have now come into their own, and they are very well funded companies, and some of them have been acquired, and And yeah, so there's been a lot of investment by venture capital funds into the legal tech space. It used to be a somewhat more fringe category. Now it's a more interesting category, I think, for also marquee investment funds. Clio raised a big round of private equity. Atrium, I mean, that's a slightly different story. They were very successful in raising money, not as successful with their business model. There have been some issues there. Ironclad's another example. Kira, all big investment rounds. Then there's been M&A activity. We've seen that Elevate, for instance, which is a big alternative legal service provider, has acquired LexPredict and is in quite aggressive acquisition mode. And then others, like Ernst & Young acquired Pangea 3, which is an LPO company from Thomson Reuters. Avo was acquired. So a lot of M&A activity, and we've seen our first IPO in legal tech. DocuSign was actually one of the successful IPOs in recent history, and I think what's interesting is that at least when I took these screenshots, DocuSign was valued at, I think, almost $11 billion in market, and had $11 billion in market cap, which was a third already of Thomson Reuters, which is the big behemoth legal information company, of course. I thought that was quite impressive. So okay, let me now go over and talk a little bit about alternative legal service providers. So that industry has been really beating expectations in terms of its growth. It's grown between, I think, 2015 and 17 from $8 billion to $10 billion in revenue. More and more legal departments are using alternative legal service providers for a whole host of different legal tasks, and law firms are also experimenting with working, partnering up with alternative legal service providers. And those alternative legal service providers are getting more and more sophisticated. When in the past they may have handled more sort of kind of mundane kind of legal issues, they're getting more sophisticated, and many times they have former big law attorneys working for them and they're providing services at a very high sort of quality of service at a quite competitive rate as compared to big law. So recently there's been also a little bit of, there's been a lot of enthusiasm in the past, of course, about legal tech and alternative legal service providers. But there's been a little bit of pushback too, where some surveys of bias of legal tech services as well as services of alternative legal service providers were suggesting that they're losing business because they're not really providing exactly the kind of solutions that the law firm that the clients need for their problems, and also some coverage about how law firms like maybe kind of slowing down a little bit their own investment in legal tech in recent years. So the pace is kind of slowing down. Anyways, we also see the emergence of new platforms. That some of those were created by consortia of law firms teaming up, where then they provide access to legal tech companies, and then in turn provide access to clients, and that helps clients save time because they don't have to vet 10 different providers of a similar legal tech product, and they can rely on their trusted outside law firm to have already vetted the legal tech company that they provide access to on a particular platform. And so it becomes like this platform almost becomes like an app store from a client's perspective. They can go on this platform and choose from a variety of third-party providers' solutions. Okay, so just to summarize those trends that I see in the legal tech and alternative legal service provider space, I would say there is certainly an increasing willingness to invest in legal tech. There are more and more legal techs also outside of the US. I would say there's been really a lot of innovation in the US market, but we see it flourish around the world. I have a group meeting during the academic year every week where people join us from around the world, legal tech entrepreneurs, and present really exciting projects. And so this is a global thing, and it's very exciting. So there's a lot of innovation happening around the world, and it is true, though, that given the amount of innovation in the market, that legal departments and law firms are somewhat overwhelmed with the amount of offerings in the market. There are new platforms, and I think that there's going to be, some also Corona-driven innovation now in legal tech and perhaps also alternative legal service providers. And we will see innovation that helps courts manage cases remotely. ODR I mentioned already. Innovation in terms of platforms allowing people accessing, government programs, government COVID programs, and I think it will become more normal also in the legal profession, to work remotely, and for people to team up around specific projects, with lawyers around the world, and there might be legal techs that will facilitate this kind of collaboration, and I think Corona will be accelerating that. All right, now let me talk a little bit. So we talked about alternative legal service providers. We talked about the legal techs. Let's talk a little bit about legal departments and law firms and some of the trends we're seeing in that space. So this is those are two snapshots from the Georgetown Law and Peer Monitor report on the state of the legal market, 2016 and 2020. And what we saw until about 2016 was sort of a flattening of demand for law firm services, and that's very much driven by the sort of this more diverse kind of field of competitors that we're seeing that are competing for the work that in the past was handled by the law firm alone. And there has been somewhat of an uptick in demand for legal services until about 2019. So, the markets were good. Some law firms really did exceedingly well. But overall, I think this image of this kind of flattening demand for services of law firms is something that we will continue to see in the future. And there's this company out of Chicago that's a sort of consulting company. They do these law firm surveys every year. They send a survey to I think 800 or so law firm managers of law firms with more than 50 lawyers in the United States. It's called the Law Firms in Transition report, and they asked every year they ask law firm managers many questions. Well, one of the questions which I think is an interesting one is do you think that commoditization of legal services is a permanent trend? And in 2016, 88% answered that question with yes, we think commoditization of legal services is a permanent trend. And what that means is that certain services, that may have been, the domain of like the most sophisticated law firm in 1 year, then the next year, sort of less, lower ranked firms were able to produce a similar service, and then maybe the next year, some online service can provide a legal service at a lower rate. That's commoditization, and that's of course commoditization is a step towards standardization and then automation, and that's where technology comes in. in recent years, in 2019, 2020, the law firm managers are somewhat less worried about commoditization. And I think that's an interesting trend. Maybe, they've been some more upbeat about their capabilities in providing these kind of bespoke services and generating more demand. Like I showed you before, there's been somewhat more demand for law firms services in recent years. And so they were a little bit more, but still, you're almost 80%. So I think, still a large majority are still feel that commoditization is a permanent trend. Just, maybe they were somewhat less worried about that. But maybe the 2016 number was just a fluke. And anyways, I thought that was an interesting thing. Still, if you look, and this is also from the Altman-Weil survey, if we look at the question, is your firm doing any of the following to increase efficiency of legal service delivery? Over 50% say, yeah, we're doing things. We're using tools to replace human resources. And we, a little bit less than half say, well, we're rewarding efficiency and profitability. But if you go down and look at things like, that are exciting from a legal innovation and legal tech point of view, like things like a systematically re-engineering of work processes, or, having a formal knowledge management program, or using non-law vendors, that's in the low 20s. So that's, it's like the large majority of these law firms are not really thinking about that. So that's not great. Still, there are law firms that are experimenting with things like creating expert systems around areas where they have particular expertise. Here are just a couple of examples of what some of the leading firms are doing. Like Ackerman's Data Breach Advisor is one such example, or Littler's Compliance HR platform, or the Travel Ban Navigator are examples of expert systems that law firms are making available to their clients, sometimes for a fee, sometimes, as a sort of a lead generation kind of tool, or as a way to kind of to tie the client a little bit more closely to the firm by providing them with these kind of useful services that hopefully are smart enough to know when the user needs to leave the automated workflow, and when he or she should be escalated, or the issue should be escalated to a human lawyer. Those are a bunch of different examples. There are also firms are experimenting with data analytics, and maybe experimenting is too cautious a word. They are really exploring this. There are some firms that are creating the role of a director of data analytics. They are also creating systems, like this is an example of a British firm that created a data-driven system to help their clients prepare for Brexit. Then there are, of course, large firms that are working with the well-known vendors in contract analytics, like DLA Piper, working with Kira, many examples of that, but also in-house, bank in-house departments investing in data-driven solutions that help them save, annual, many hundreds of thousands of hours of annual work by lawyers and loan officers. I think there's a solid opportunity for legal innovation in helping law firms make that transition from turning kind of legal services into products. And there are companies like this company Joseph out of Australia that helps law firms turn their expertise into products and workflows. And yet we see that in 70% of the law firm, in spite of these examples that I have just given you, it is clear also from the law firms in the transition survey that in 70% of law firms, the partners resist most change efforts. And that's been consistently so. My friend Ralph Baxter, who's the former chairman of a big law firm called Orrick, says that most law firms see technology as an expense, and they hold the CIOs responsible for limiting this expense. And instead, I think they need to realize that technology is not an expense. Technology is an investment into the future of the firm. And some firms have started to recognize that. Some of them have even created subsidiaries or wholly owned companies that are just focused on creating technical legal tech solutions for their clients. Wilson Sonsini created a service, a company last year. I think their first product was a product that helped their clients navigate the new California privacy law. But similar things happening around the world. Is another example of a German firm that did that. SKW Schwarz did the same thing. And I think this is happening globally, and this shows that I think the firms have recognized that there is a business to be made by turning bespoke legal services into products, and this, I think these are some of the kind of leading efforts in this space. All right, just to summarize the trends on the law firms and corporate legal department side. I think legal tech is, for most law firms, is not an essential yet. I think the business model of most law firms is still based on a billable hour. You will hear a lot that there are trends to alternative fee agreements and that sort of thing. But by and large, most law firms are still charging by the hour, which is, of course, not furthering the law firm's incentives in being efficient. And then from a client's perspective, the legal service is no longer differentiated. Most law firms, don't provide a differentiated service. This is also clear from what the law firm managers say. And if we look at who's really driving the current innovation that we're seeing in legal tech, then we have to say it's the corporate legal departments that are investing in innovation, and that are really sort of giving a chance to many of those legal techs that are really kind of pushing the innovation envelope, and they are this is where the innovation is happening between the legal techs and the corporate law departments, not really in the law firms. I think Dan, Professor Katz has called the legal techs sometime in the past. He called them the outsourced R&D departments of the law firms. I think that's a really good way of describing it. There are, of course, also kind of these regulatory issues that many innovative legal tech companies are facing. These kind of entries to entry barriers to the market that are unauthorized practice of law rules, which in many cases have their justification, but they've been used also in many countries around the world to chill innovation, like unauthorized practice of law rules and fee splitting rules, for example. There are efforts going on in different countries to experiment with the business model to facilitate more innovation, to provide more access to justice. The UK and Australia have been leading there. They created the ABS models. Germany, most recently, has been trying to reform its laws on the legal profession to allow for more innovation. In the US, there's been different task forces on the ABA. A lot of innovation is getting stuck at the bar level. I mean, a lot of reform efforts are getting stuck. So anyway, so this is an ongoing debate. It would be interesting to see if Corona may have an impact there too, in terms of maybe facilitating us, making the legal regimes governing the practice of law a little bit more flexible in allowing for more access to justice. Some more solutions to blossom that provide more access to justice. Utah and Arizona in the U.S. have a regulatory, things called the regulatory sandbox projects going on. Anyways, that's a whole different story. But there are some efforts going on to really push for more a more liberal market where these providers can provide their services without having to fear litigation from the bar. Okay, there's a lot of innovation in terms of AI also in the administration. We had a policy practicum that Professor Engstrom offered at the law school last year. I think they tracked in the US about 150 different or more uses of AI by the administration, and like Social Security, EPA, IRS, and that raised a lot of interesting opportunities, but also questions. One of the companies that came out of our research at Codex called Symbiom, they call themselves the computational law company. They're trying to facilitate the creation of computational law systems by government actors, currently working with municipalities on construction rules. But I think that's an area that creates a lot of opportunity too, in terms of allowing the citizens to interact with the government more efficiently, and companies helping in this interaction. All right, so also lots of innovators in legal tech space have really shifted or have started to use their talents to help in the fight against the pandemic. One of our fellows has created a Corona Atlas project that tracks all the different Corona regulations in the United States, sort of local mask, rules and shelter-in-place rules. And so that's an interesting project. Another example in Germany, where a platform popped up that helps individuals get their COVID benefits from the government. Things like that are popping up around the world. Those are just two examples. And I think those are interesting trends in legal tech. All right, and there's of course, always a little bit of also a backlash sometimes to deplore. Last year, France has said that these companies, these data analytics companies, judicial analytics companies that show, how judges are deciding cases and show their, the statistics of these judges, they're not allowed to publish the names of the judges based on privacy reasons. And they say judges have a right to privacy, and therefore these companies are not allowed to publish their names next to their decisions. And that was something that was sort of criticized quite heavily by the sort of legal innovation community, and that's kind of like chilling innovation in this kind of judicial analytics space. In the US, there's many providers that are like Lex Machina, which is one of the companies that came out of Codex, is one of the trailblazers in that space, where it's very clear that you can, the people have a right to know the names of the judges that are making the decisions, the legal decisions, and we have a right to see what their decision metrics are. So anyway, that was a little bit deplored. Anyway, so those are all questions of legal technology and some of the trends in legal technology. The other question that's become of great interest is also a more kind of a legal and policy question, which is, how should we regulate all these algorithms that are making ever more important decisions about our lives? That's a separate question, but it's something that I think is an important trend, and I think for a lot of lawyers interested in technology in general, but also in legal technology, it's an ever more important topic. Anyways, just a word about trends in legal education. The famous Larry Ripstein, Larry Ripstein, has written about, sort of future of legal education almost 10 years ago, and he said, let me see. He said, in general, this legal information market creates a new task for legal educators. Instead of just learning how to counsel individuals on their context-specific and idiosyncratic problems, legal experts need to be able to use legal information to design products for general use or for trading capital assets. He's kind of a visionary in that, and we've seen that this is really where things are headed today. At Codex, we have for a long time sort of declared that we feel that every lawyer has to know at least the basics of legal informatics, and we see many law schools in the U.S. and around the world experiment with teaching legal technology to students. And we've seen great summer programs pop up, like the Bucerius summer school, of course. And if you go back to that question that I asked earlier, do we see this disruption that many lawyers have been kind of worried about several years ago? I would say no, we don't. I think we're seeing sort of an accelerated evolution towards these kind of new delivery models for legal services. But do we see a disruption? I don't think so. Not at the moment, but it could come. I would still say that all lawyers, if you're in law school or if you are in a law firm or corporate law department or the government, I think we should still take on this challenge that AI is presenting us and this opportunity. And for that, I think we need to we need to think about it. We need to this is all about change and change management, and I think we need to think about it on these sort of 4 levers that we ought to think about in general when we think about change. In the governance layer, on the cultural layer, on the structural layer, on the operations layer. It's usually the hardest to change the culture of an organization when we talk about embracing change. But that's really where the action is in terms of effectuating change. That's the hardest to change, but it creates the most sustainable change. And so when we ask ourselves, how are we going to embrace these new opportunities that technology provides us with, I think we need to ask ourselves the question, what's the value that law firms and corporate legal departments or government legal departments or lawyers in general are contributing today, and what's the value they contribute tomorrow? And I think there's a ton of opportunity out there. We've seen a lot of exciting things emerge over recent years. And I feel that the current crisis will accelerate this innovation movement in legal. And I would encourage everyone who's interested in the space to get started. And the best way to start is by thinking big and starting small. So anyway, so that is my quick introduction. I know my talk was titled sort of legal innovation in Silicon Valley. I went a little bit beyond Silicon Valley. I hope you will forgive me. I'm gonna close here now, and I'm excited to hear any questions that you may have for me.
Okay, thank you, Roland. Well, Dirk and I have been collecting the questions in the queue. There are 55 questions in the queue, so we're probably not going to, folks, cover every single one of them. Again, I'm sure Roland would be happy if you want to pose a question to him later on if we don't get to yours on Twitter, #Bucerius Legal Tech. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer those, as many as he can. I guess one thing I just wanted to ask at the outset, which came up in one of the questions, where do you see the priorities for Codex over, say, the next 2 or 3 years? That was something that came up, and I just kind of wondered what your perspective, kind of seeing everything that's, we've gone on this journey to here, and what's kind of next on the horizon as you see it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, like I said before, our focus is really um, on computational law, which is the automation and mechanization of legal analysis. And we have a very big interest in computable contracts, and we are in the process of launching we have been working in this space for some time. We're about to launch a big project in that space. But we're more broadly interested in computable law in the enterprise. You know, how does computable law make the insurance industry more efficient? How does it work in government? And so we have a strong interest in those questions. Of course, access to justice is also near and dear to our heart. But we are sort of, a Codex is a research center, but we're also a community. And the community aspect, I think, is very important. I think we have some amazing people involved who I think are really leading the pack, and we're there to kind of support their work. And they may have projects that might not fall sort of squarely into that computational law realm, but we still want to support them because we think they're worthwhile projects. But yeah, if you ask me, so I think, computable contracts, computable law, and the enterprise are important projects for us in the next couple of years.
Okay, great. Over to Dirk for our next question.
Yes, we had a very specific question to start with, because you have created this resource, the Tech Index, and Dan has mentioned that in our 101 session. And someone said, do you have a roadmap to share? Because there's a lot of information there. And I remember hearing about it, that people want to do something about it. Is there any news you can share regarding the Tech Index?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question too. So the Tech Index came about as a project of students. It was built by students, and it's it's at a point where we feel it's time for the 2.0 version, and we have a plan to launch that in the near future. I wish I had our fellow Peter Gunst here, who's really in charge of that project. So yeah, I think we want to add some functionality there and add some additional data points for us to track, like who are the founders, what sort of the different, what are the demographics of the founders, things like that. But yeah, I would ask you to kind of stay tuned. We'll make an announcement in the near future about some of the changes that the very specific changes that are coming out on our database.
That's great to hear. Now, we have something going in depth around computational law. Someone said, how do you make sure that if you deploy these solutions, you're not adding more need for translators? So now we would have the legal language, then we would have a tech legal language, and then we might need people to translate between this. Like, are there good plans on how you would make it that standardized, that this becomes actually deployable? And what are your thoughts on maybe this being one of the obstacles of the concept of computation?
This is a great point too. So our research director, Professor Ginesser, is a computer scientist, and he comes from the rules-based side, and he would argue that we've developed a language to express legal concepts in a way that domain experts can master, and you don't need to translate, so that a programmer that's not trained in the law can build a system that a computer can understand. And I think there's a trend in that direction to create these systems where the domain experts can create the computable law system. If we are already there yet, I don't think so. I think we're still a few years away from that, where it's easy, and we still have that issue of translating from lawyer to the computer scientist. In a sense, it's also what inspired the name of our center, Codex. We're like the intersection of the legal code and the computer code. And some things might be lost in translation. You have no guarantee that it's like accurately implemented in the legal concepts of a contract, for instance, of a smart contract, are accurately implemented in a system, and that can create to the system malfunctioning and potential liability for people who created the system.
And I will just say to add to this, just to connect, this is a theme that we've seen in the first two sessions when I sort of, between what Dan Lena talked about yesterday and what I talked about the intro session. This is a long-standing debate, actually, both in computer science between rules-based approaches and data-driven approaches, and in legal theory between the formalists and the realists. And the idea that, is it even possible to fully specify the contours of a legal problem within four corners? I mean, this is just...
Yes.
So in some ways, this is what I would say, and I'm more, as everyone knows, on the data side of this. There are more and more areas of law where there is the possibility of at least having greater levels of specification. I think that's kind of the halfway between the two camps. Let's say it is a debate anyway.
That's a great way to explain this, and I think this is an opportunity to bring together both the rules-driven and the data-driven side have their own strengths and weaknesses.
They do.
And you mean a data-driven, if you just create a system that replicates the world out there, how it functions, the legal realist version, I suppose, you might bake in a lot of injustices that you don't want in a system.
That's
right?
True. That's absolutely right.
And if you have a just rules-driven side, rules-driven system that might be too rigid to accommodate the real world. And so I think there's a great opportunity in bringing this strengths of both approaches together in some of the new kind of use cases.
Okay, back to Dirk for a question.
So if we turn a bit more towards the market, I have one question here from our dean who is attending this, and she's referring to your 70% of law firms who do not see legal technology as an investment. And she was wondering, what is that based on? What is the methodology behind that? And do you have an estimate for how long this percentage or this higher percentage will last? Is it just a matter of time? Will circumstances change in your opinion? What does the future look like here?
So the 70% are, that's from the survey, the Altman-Wild survey, where they say 70% of the law firms queried, and again, this is about 800 managing partners of law firms with more than 50 lawyers in the US. They say that in our firm, it's 70% of those queried say most of the partners in my firm, they don't want to change anything. And so in the past, they even said, they asked them questions like, would you give up some of your earnings to protect your, the freedom you have, right? Because many of the partners, they feel that, with more technology and more data, and that comes more control, and they lose some of their independence, and they're very protective of that. And anyways, and so that's that's from this survey. This is survey data from the managing partners saying that in my firm, I've been trying to do this, and most of the partners are resistant to these change efforts. And then the other data point is from a managing partner that I know, who's also very progressive and who's really made Oric into a leading brand. I think he turned it from a $70 million law firm a year to $1 billion law firm a year by making some very innovative choices. And he said he's really in tune with what managing partners and how law firms operate. And he said, well, it is still the case that for most firms, investment in technology is viewed as an expense, and it's not an investment. And so that's why I thought that is very interesting. And so that's why I quoted him there.
Gotcha. Now we have, I think, some questions that go into the direction of what does the market look like? And maybe given your particular perspective as someone working in that very famous institution over in Stanford, one person out here was wondering, do you see particularities of the Silicon Valley ecosystem that make legal technology companies successful over there? Or is that something that could just as well happen in technology parks around the world?
Well, I've been living in Silicon Valley for 20 years, and there's something that's kind of magic, I think, and not just for legal tech, but for tech in general. There, it's just a very diverse talent pool there, and an ability to access capital and to, once you have a product market fit, to really light the rocket boosters and scale quickly. There's an environment, an ecosystem there, from the law firms from the VCs to the law firms to the caterers. It's just very good at, once you have a product market fit, to scale quickly. But that's not really the kind of businesses that we have in legal tech. That's that's an Uber. But in legal tech, I don't think it is that essential to be in Silicon Valley, frankly. There are investors who say, okay, we only invest in companies that are in the Silicon Valley, but I think the legal tech sales cycles are kind of long, and it's different things that it's not so necessarily winning the race to the market that decides over your success.
Gotcha. So following up on that one, we have a question or two questions that I'd like to combine here. One was, so is there a trend where you see that some solutions might go mobile only? So skip basically desktop computers. And I think connected to that quite often is a different question that we had here. Someone said, can we talk a bit about solutions in developing countries? And I know that you at Codex, you always try to bring in people from developing countries and to get their perspective. And I'm just thinking about these two things. Is there maybe a new market out there where that is not at all like Silicon Valley, that might provide ecosystems that work entirely differently, where mobile might play a bigger role because that's how the internet is dispersed over there? You have thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting. So, I think, our, what's his name? The gentleman who did Jason Browder, he's like this young gentleman who started this, got a lot of coverage about his robo-lawyer challenging traffic tickets, right? And I think he's going after many different use cases, and I think those kinds of things that are very kind of specific to one application. You got a ticket, you want to challenge it right away with your little robo-lawyer app or legal chatbot. I think that can go straight to your phone. I've also know some people who are creating a whole kind of blockchain-based banking infrastructure for mobiles for developing countries, and so there are people doing that kind of thing. I think so. Let me see. So there's I think the Heel Institute in the Netherlands, they're really focused on supporting kind of legal innovation in developing countries. It'd be interesting to see how much of those projects that come out of that are just kind of phone native and not going to the desktop. I don't have any data, but it's an interesting question to ask, I think.
And I think for people who are following the institute, it's HIL, right?
Yeah, HIIL.
HIIL. Sorry. So if you want to
put it in the chat window for everyone. So one question, Roland, that has people have posed throughout the sessions thus far, but I think it's one to be great for you to address is, we have a range of folks actually in a range of different stages of their careers, but the substantial majority of people are young lawyers or law students. Do you have any thoughts for them about, how they might get involved in these ideas, or what's a good starting place? I mean, they pose the same question to me, but I'd love to get your perspective on it, for folks on the call.
hopefully if you're still in law school, hopefully your law school is offering something in that direction. Not many do. I mean, I gave you some examples, but there's a tremendous amount of resources online. Like, you joining this session alone, I think this is a great community that Bucerius Law School has built up, a global community, and just kind of getting hooked into that is a great way to understand, get sort of the basic framework and context there. Then there are, if you want to start building things, there are legal hacker communities in, I think, over 150 countries or so. Jameson Dempsey, who's a fellow with Codex, he's one of the main organizers of legal hackers globally. And there's in countries that I just spoke to somebody from Nigeria. They have groups there, and in Brazil and everywhere. I think getting connected with legal hackers around the world is a great way. If you have ideas you wanna test, you wanna bounce off someone, there's a bunch of different conferences you can go to. You can join my center's group meetings, present every Thursday at 1:30 during the year, your Pacific time. We love to have you join and share what you're working on. I think those are some of the ways you can do that. And I think it's for folks, for law students, this is really the future. I think thinking about ways how legal services is a huge opportunity there. The market is like it's a $1 trillion market globally, and so many things are still working in an archaic way, and there's a ton of opportunity for people who come to it with a fresh mindset, an entrepreneurial mindset or intrapreneurial mindset, if you want to innovate within an existing organization. And that creates opportunity, right? And you can create services that you can make accessible to more people for lower cost than bespoke services, and you can still do really well. There's tons of examples out there of people who do it already, and I think there's a ton more opportunity in the future.
I'm happy that you mentioned Legal Hackers. For those of you wondering, that is one of the logos you saw because we partnered with Legal Hackers, the local chapter here in Hamburg, but also with the global organization to get the message out about this program. And it really is a great way to meet like-minded people in your community. Now, Roland, I have 2 small questions left for you before, I know that it gets warm in your hotel room, and I appreciate that.
Sorry, I'm melting here. It's like, I hadn't realized how hot it is here. Sorry.
But that's good. I mean, it's good you're in good weather. We realize that you are also on holidays, so we don't want to keep you for too long. But I think there's 2 more questions. The one I'd like you to answer first is, we all know the power of platforms in Silicon Valley economy. And do you see any areas of consolidation, like an Amazon of law? Do you see something happening there? And then maybe you can close off with, if you have them, any book recommendations, anything that you think people should have a look at. And I mean, there's one obvious choice, but those are the final 2 things that we have time for right now.
Super. Yeah. So I think, yes, I think there will be consolidation. I think some of those, like I mentioned, alternative legal service providers are very acquisitive, like Elevate. And there's also LexisNexis has acquired several companies that came out of Codex, and others, of course. So the big legal information companies are investing, I think, in the space, of course, and they have over the past. New players are players like Elevate, and then law firms too. I think law firms are, starting to, and the big 4, I think, are all in this game, and I think there will be some consolidation. And also within the different verticals in legal tech, there are some that are emerging as leaders. It might be in data analytics, or it might be in court reporting, or contract analytics, or there's a lot of players, or contract management. And I feel like some of those that are emerging as the leaders because they have the best product and the right finances, they will be able to consolidate some of those branches. And What was the second question?
Oh yeah, sure. The second question was really on any good books that might be.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I've been editing for a long time a book which has, chapters of some really, really brilliant people in the space, including a gentleman named Dirk Hartung, as well as a gentleman named Dan Katz,
Great book
and
already.
others.
It's the best book in the internet.
Okay. It's coming out in Edward Elgar Publishing, hopefully in a couple of months. We are, in the publishing phase, and this is covering all these exciting research projects that are going on and bringing data analytics to legal information problems in different areas of law, and also sort of like in topics that are sort of spanning across different areas. So that's coming out, and I'm very excited about that. Then of course I would say Kevin Ashley's work on in terms of books, his book on legal analytics that came out 2 years ago is a really it's an intense book, but it's very, very good and very informative. And then of course Richard Susskind's works. He's like the leading thinker and has been for several decades in legal innovation, and has written some really great books, and is a great writer, and so many more. And of course, also articles and that you can find. So there's a lot of great stuff out there. But those are some of the things that come to mind. Okay, well then, Roland, thank you so much for being with us tonight here in Europe, and during the day, of course, at other parts. It was great to have you. It was a good session, and maybe I'll share the hashtag again if you guys have some more burning questions, and Roland has some time on his hands and his mobile phone. He'll be able to answer them if you tweet them here to Bucerius Legal Tech. We'll make sure that all of the questions that you have somehow get seen and answered. And that's really all we can do for tonight. It was great having you all, and then hopefully see you, most of you, tomorrow again. Take care. Bye-bye. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Good to see you all, and stay safe.